Can you hear me? This is apparently a very special place in Morris. Not only because we're all here, but I slipped and fell in the bathroom in the hotel last night. And I've been suffering from back pain for months. And I feel actually better. So it's a miracle. Anyway, I'm not a believer, but if I weren't, maybe that's a sign. I'm going to talk today about the many problems that are facing the country and how I think that cooperatives can play a role in solving those. So I titled the talk, Escaping the Double Bind, Cooperative Regeneration in a Time of Crisis, and I will get to what I mean by those terms. So I was already introduced, and I met many of you last night at the restaurant. So as most of you know, I guess you live here and you probably read a newspaper or a blog or watch the news, and there's a lot of problems going on. And I've just found here a bunch of headlines that suggest that the United States is in many ways more and more resembling a dystopia. And this comes from many angles, from the economic and other angles. And anyway, I don't need to tell you all this. You see it. There's polarization. The Democrats believe the Republicans are racist. The Republicans believe the Democrats are socialists. There's massive inequality. Bernie Sanders has, of course, said that the top three families own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the country. PolitiFact has verified that is true. The Rand Corporation, which is not a left-wing Marxist-Leninist group, they were planning the Cold War, so they actually have done research that between 1975 to the present, $79 trillion of wealth has been transferred from the working class to the top. And Benjamin Page at Northwestern University, I find very inspiring researcher who has been dealing with inequality for decades, has found that basically the policy of this country reflects more the ultra-wealthy, not even the 1% like Occupy Wall Street, but the 0.1%. And in fact, so most Americans appear, as he says, to have a statistically insignificant effect on politics. Of course, environmental degradation, I don't need to tell you all this. We've had, train crashes here, like in East Palestine in Ohio, and, we're going beyond planetary boundaries in many ways. There's the heat dome right now. This is the new normal. So there's a lack of accountability, in many ways, a lack of transparency, both in government and in business. So in many ways, we're dealing with a similar situation that was just discussed. And in fact, as the weavers, we're dealing with low quality products, and this is coming from not only the market but also from government. So all these things are going on. Of course, in business, we have a crisis of business successions. Millions of small businesses worldwide, including in the United States, are facing a crisis. Nobody is there to take on the helm. So you have businesses that might face insolvency, not because they're doing poorly, but because nobody basically is there. There's a disappearance of local media. This is an article just from the Minnesota Star Tribune that finds that 3 newspapers are going to close because of the heightened costs in printing. And so this is a problem facing not only Minnesota, but the entire country and the world right now. To me, this looks like a double bind. Now, getting back to this topic, what is a double bind? It's a term that emerged in psychology in the 1950s and describes basically a paradox. So I found this quote to be quite cogent here. A mother tells her son, you need to move out and be independent. And at the same time, she tells him, you could never live without me. And what is the son to think? So in many ways, this is what we're facing at the present. It's a paradox. And the paradox that we're facing, of course, requires oftentimes, and this is what the psychologists say, new behaviors. So developing new behaviors. And the double bind I see is the lack of citizen engagement. And of course, that results from a flawed political and economic system that responds to a minority elite and that basically is unresponsive to the majority. And that carrying on the issue from the psychologists to the political and social and the entrepreneurial business level requires new behaviors to escape. That's the point. And so the rest of my talk is not theory. You all are practitioners, I promise. That was kind of just the, putting your toe in the cold water. We'll be focused on how mutualistic cooperation can possibly help to resolve this double bind. And of course, we're here to cooperatively build a better world. So how do you do that, and what does it mean? So what is mutualistic cooperation? Well, here's a little bit more theory or history, I would say. I have 3 sources that inspire me personally. I hope they are useful to you: Charles Darwin, Piotr Kropotkin, and Karl Polanyi. And I will briefly just talk about them. This is a wall of text. I find it difficult to cut this quote. It's from Darwin's book on the origin, not the origin of species, but on the descent of man. This was Darwin's second great book. And I find this quote to be quite inspiring, because he's asking here, during his voyages in the South Pacific, how do people cooperate? And even among cannibalists and among other types of what he called primitive societies, we have different terminology today. Of course, he was a 19th century Englishman, so that comes with the territory, so to speak. But he's asking here, it may be asked, within the limits of the same tribe, did a large number of members first become endowed with social and moral qualities, and how was the standard of excellence raised? Basically, he says, if somebody is altruistic or kind or generous, their descendant, basically they would die in war, and their descendants, he says, they sacrifice his life rather than betray his comrades, that they would leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature. So in essence, over time, people should get more and more selfish according to this principle of natural selection. A few passages later in his book, he actually kind of stumbles on the answer. And he says, in fact, it's not an issue of individuals, but societies. And societies that generate more generous or kind or morally, endowed individuals are those that, he says here, have an advantage to one tribe over the other. So kindness pays at the higher social level. And my colleague David Sloan Wilson, an evolutionary biologist, has called this multi-level selection. Selection is not happening at the level of genes, but higher at the social level. So, this picture you might have seen, collective activity allows us basically to engage in what are otherwise hostile environments. Piotr Kropotkin, Russian anarchist, prince, very interesting guy. There should be a film about his life. He was really very pioneering in many ways. He gave up a very, could have been a privileged position in the court of the Tsar in Moscow to go to Siberia to study plant and animal life and human life there. And he was very opposed to the doctrine of social Darwinism at the time, becoming very dominant. And basically what he found in his voyages and travels through Siberia was what he called the principle of mutual aid. And just very briefly, he found it, for instance, in bees. He says, these small insects, owing to the mutual aid they practice, attain such a degree of well-being and safety as no isolated animal can ever expect to achieve, however strong or well-armed it may be. And about human beings, he said, the practice of mutual aid and its successive developments have created the very conditions of social life in which man was enabled, and women, of course, to develop arts, knowledge, and intelligence, and that the periods when institutions based on the mutual aid tendency took their greatest development were also the periods of the greatest progress in arts, industry, and science. So it comes natural to human beings, and especially in the harsh conditions of Siberia, it was absolutely essential for people to support each other. Polanyi was he was an Austrian-Hungarian economist, anthropologist, philosopher, did a little bit of everything. And growing up in Vienna, he saw basically an alternative to this absolute raw market economy, which he called the formal economy. This means ends-based notion based on scarcity, this what we call economical or economizing logic. And he says basically this discounts the notion of deliberate change, and what if we want something different? And to do that, he developed a more extended notion of economy based on observations of many societies across the world, both during his own life and historically, and basically says you find exchange in markets, you find that, but you also see redistribution where there is what he calls an appropriational movement toward a center, and out of it again you have welfare, social welfare policies and these types of things, but also there's reciprocity, which he described as movements between correlative points of symmetrical groupings. We're in a reciprocal exchange. I don't anticipate money from you, but perhaps you give me something, I give you something in return. And so this notion, this extended notion of substantive economy for Polanyi incorporated or included the great variety of basic institutions that existed across time other than markets, and he found it to be the most suitable to deal with all of the empirical economies that existed across time and space. So basically, learning new behaviors is apparently what gets one out of a double bind. And of course, we're dealing not with psychology, with a controlling mother, but we're dealing with a political system very complex with many different problems. So that requires not individual psychology, but organizational learning, and basically dealing with the reality that we have today, receiving that as well, he was also multi-disciplinary, and Konitos Castoriadis talked about reception and alteration. So we receive what is given to us and we alter that in a slight way and then give that, so to speak, back to the next generation. What he called an instituting society that deals democratically with another and is in conversation rather than accepting merely what is written in stone and what is permanent, so to speak. And so this describes the capacity to convert the given confines of the here and now into an open horizon of possibilities. And that's what we need to be focusing on, dealing with imagination and learning and creativity, and dealing with these in a not only individualistic manner, but also in a collective manner in a way that is decentralized. And and that is, for instance, the philosopher Kant talked about genius, but he was also focused on individuals. What is the notion of collective genius? That could be something. On the left here is a publication that we put out earlier this year dealing with imagination in the current moment of the capitalist scene. So basically, okay, how do cooperatives fit into all of this? Georg Draheim was a German thinker and economist and talked about the dual nature of cooperatives. Cooperatives have both an associational and a commercial or entrepreneurial nature. In fact, cooperatives are an association of individuals which own, so to speak, an enterprise, rather than just being, so to speak, an investor who hires labor. And Midland Cooperator, excellent newspaper from Minnesota, by the way, the editor, Joe Gilbert, described cooperation as democracy applied to making a living. They are principles-based enterprises. I don't have to tell you people this, you know this. They are schools of doing together. We have the ICA principles, you know, these 7 principles, you know, could swear an oath on them, I'm sure you've heard this before. One member, one vote, education, these types of things. The interesting thing to me about cooperatives is that the rights to membership, and my friend David Ellerman has written very extensively on this, it's not a property right, but it's a personal right. This is why oftentimes you cannot sell your membership in a cooperative like you can sell a stock. This is important. There's also evidence for spillovers, so-called spillovers in co-ops. Carol Pateman wrote her doctoral dissertation in 1970 on this topic, basically saying that enterprises that are more democratic induce people to be more politically engaged overall. And that could be a means to change behaviors and deal with this double bind. My colleague Marcelo Vieta has written on this topic as well, looking at more up-to-date literature and examples of the spillover in places like Argentina and beyond. I'll get to that. So they're neither, in my opinion, for-profit or non-profit. They could be described as not for-profit. I mean, surpluses are generated. We can talk about the term profit itself is problematic, rather a surplus. Third sector is also used. And one of the things that I think I've noticed in my research is that cooperatives are oftentimes not as embedded in larger networks as they could be. I'm not sure if you've discussed this in your conversations in the past evening. And so, in my opinion, this requires best practices and an observation and learning. The major corporations are all communicating, they're sharing board members and so on. So co-ops need to be doing that as well, learning from each other and sharing best practices. So these are the 2 books that we've been working on the past 3 years. The first one is out on the left. It's the Rutledge Handbook of Cooperative Economics and Management. It's open access. You can freely download it. You don't have to go to hacker websites. Just go to the publisher's site. It's 36 chapters in 5 sections. from theory all the way to things like innovation, management, governance, sustainability. We have a whole section on the role of cooperatives in dealing with sustainability. Then we have on the right one that's upcoming. It's called Global Cooperative Economics and Movements, which is more a panorama of practices and best practices internationally on 6 continents, 29 chapters, including one chapter. The first chapter is written by 5 scholars from 5 continents: North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, dealing with the cooperative movements and the various diversity of experiences on 6 continents, or 5 continents rather. Well, actually 6 continents. So there's 29 chapters there. So cooperatives, of course, improve health. As we found, they reduce inequality, they generate community wealth. This is some pictures from Imola. This is a city in Italy, about 40 kilometers from Bologna. I recommend you visit. It's more than 50% of the population are members of a cooperative there. It's famous, of course, for Formula One racing. That's why the car is there, and for its balsamic vinegar. But also, they have a lot of co-ops. As I mentioned, 50%, more than 50% of the population are members, and more than 50% of the industrial output is from about 15 industrial cooperatives. And 3 of them are global market leaders. So they have subsidiaries all over the world, including China. And basically, they are present in every sector in the economy, and there's even actually a consulting business that's cooperative there. So you see these places, and I would like to just present kind of a menu a la carte of some best practices that perhaps can stimulate conversations amongst yourselves, friends, and colleagues. So I've done most of my research, I live in Germany, but I've done most of my research on co-ops in Italy, which I find to be a very inspiring case study and example. To me, it's the most developed ecosystem of co-ops in the world. You have the Basque region in Spain as well, which is quite developed. But Italy has a very long tradition of cooperatives and a long-standing consensus around the cooperative model, a cooperative development model, you could even say, and seeing them as problem solvers. So you had Catholic cooperatives since the 19th century. You also had, you have now the Pope, Pope Leo XIV. Leo XIII, who he kind of took the mantle of, wrote an encyclical 1893, Rerum Novarum, and that basically proposed to see the rights of workers and the rights of laborers being respected, and even promoted cooperatives in some sense. And there were socialists and communists in Italy that also got behind the cooperative model as a means to achieve socialism, and also liberal nationalists. So there was a movement to unify Italy around 1860, 1870, and a lot of those proponents also used cooperatives to basically advance and develop the country. So all of these groups kind of coalesced around the cooperative, and in the subsequent decades, they have been utilized in Italy to solve other problems, including mental health care, community, entrepreneurship, rural revitalization, and most recently worker buyouts. And there are a lot of funding mechanisms there. So we have some chapters in the upcoming book on community cooperatives and institutional innovation. And I just want to very briefly survey some of the best practices that I found in Italy. Now, I've done my research using what's called path dependency analysis, which I don't want to bore you with, but the idea is, of course, that the history matters, and that early, so to speak, steps in development matter later on. And so, for instance, in Italy, you had a fight against fascism. Basically, in 1924, Mussolini came to power, and the co-ops were very much protagonists against, or antagonists, one could say, against Mussolini. They went into the underground. They were punished largely for this, but after the war, the partisans who fought against fascism recognized the important role of cooperatives, and they're even anchored in the Italian constitution. So even today, if you look at Article 45 of the Constitution of the Republic of Italy, it says the Republic recognizes the social function of cooperation of a mutually supportive, non-speculative nature. The law promotes and encourages cooperation through appropriate means and ensures its character and purposes through appropriate checks. And so this led to a situation that allowed cooperatives to be important in rebuilding the country. And there was a lot of development going on, urbanization. So the bonds that had basically supported social life for decades, or even you could say thousands of years, had been burst asunder. People were moving into cities, things were changing, and this created problems, amongst others, in the social
social care and mental health care provision. So basically at the time there was all of this tumult going on. I'm not going to give you the long version of it, but what ended up happening was that the Italian legislature saw what was going on in certain parts by people like Franco Basaglia, who's pictured here, who was a psychiatrist dealing with basically radical new ways to doing and performing social care. Instead of having the one flew over the cuckoo's nest method of locking people up, basically it was the idea that care could be provided in a democratic way with the voice of patients themselves. And so the legislature, basically dealing with a crisis and seeing what was going on, said, well, we can generalize this model. So in 1978, a law was passed to close the asylum systems in Italy, which were outdated and really dehumanizing. And between 1978 and 1991, the model was developed. And so in 1991, you had the first law on regulating social cooperatives, multi-stakeholder cooperatives that provide care, that are community-based, locally based, municipally based, membership, including the municipality, patients themselves, caregivers, and basically you have to talk to each other. And that's a very interesting and I think a phenomenon that has been replicated since then in Quebec, in Sweden, in Japan, and other places. I have heard even here in Minnesota. Immediately after this law was passed in 1991, there were rural communities that were basically losing population, depopulating, that saw what was going on in social care provision and said, well, we need care, we need provision, but we're not patients. So they basically hacked the social cooperative model for basically providing services to the entire community. So you had the birth moment, the birth hour of the community cooperative. The top left picture is a small town actually near Imola called Suciso, and it was dying out. People were moving away, young people were moving into cities, and the last remaining citizens basically banded together and said, we're going to start a social cooperative. We're not providing social care, or rather mental health care, but we want to ensure that the last bed and breakfast, the last bar in town remains open, and giving some kind of form of employment to our citizens. So they created this kind of one-stop shop for tourists and others to interact. And in fact, they have one of the best restaurants in the region now, so I've heard. And so this stuff is really important. And what ended up happening was you got this word of mouth process where basically community organizers visited Suciso, and you had people in the south of Italy. The bottom left picture is Melpignano, which is a medieval village in the south of Italy that I visited. And this was the first formal community cooperative. What ended up happening was a local mayor was interested in developing the village's resources. And there was a project to build a huge photovoltaic gigawatt plant outside of this medieval village. And the citizens, about 70 of them, organized against what was going on and said, why do we need this? It's going to destroy the beautiful ambience of the village. They were not against photovoltaic and renewables, but they said, well, let's do it differently. We have flat roofs in our medieval village. Let's just put the photovoltaic panels on top and we will produce energy for ourselves, by ourselves. And that was basically what ended up happening. They started a cooperative, and together with the largest federation of cooperatives in Italy, they they basically created a draft law, a regional law for community cooperatives, a totally new form of cooperatives, and that basically create value not for the members, but for a very disparate notion of community outside of the membership even. And so this model has since taken off in Italy and elsewhere, and about 200 of these exist even in big cities. So I visited some of these, for instance, in the north, in Genoa, that is basically revitalizing the historical center of the town, which had become derelict, full of drugs and crime. And so they've turned it into a thriving place where there's craft beer and things that are being sold, and musicians and theater and all these types of things. The Macora framework, just to mention, has been around since 1985 and allows struggling businesses basically to be taken over by their workers in Italy. So what happens is that the workers can take in one lump sum 2 years of their unemployment benefits as a grant towards taking over the business, which goes a long way if you have several employees. There's also an ecosystem of banks and public finance institutions that can offer loans and grants to assist. And so you've had several hundred, I think about 400 of these types of businesses that have been taken over and converted into cooperatives in Italy. And the average lifespan of businesses once they've been converted has been 12 years, which if you look at the statistics of business longevity, there's about 5 years of every business in the world that's in terms of its anticipated lifespan. So that's another miracle, you could say. And my friends Marcelo Vieta and Marco Lomuscio have been researching these for some years. Lastly, Italy has a very major cooperative development fund that certainly can be emulated and should be inspiring to any cooperative practitioner. So it's a private sector cooperative development fund. It was initiated in 1991 by the largest cooperative federation, Lega Coop. Today, it's a little bit more than 30 years old. They just celebrated their 30th anniversary. They are more than €500 million in assets, about $600 million. It's the largest cooperative development fund in the world, receives funding from about 15,000 or more cooperatives. They each provide about 3% of their profits or surpluses every year for investment and development of the cooperative sector. So if you don't make profits, you don't pay. That's the idea. It's a mutualistic fund. They also call themselves that. They provide business plans, investment projects. They do turnarounds. They do factoring services, very basic services, loans, grants. They have accelerators. They have an incubator and similar activities. About $3 million annually they provide for just cooperative education. They do a lot with renewable energy and outfitting co-ops basically with these types of this type of infrastructure. So just going beyond Italy, I want to mention a few other practices to inspire, hopefully, yourselves and the community. So you have cooperative development funds worldwide that do incubation and that do acceleration. In our upcoming book, we have a chapter on both Uruguay and Chile. Uruguay has had a cooperative development fund since 2015. They actually worked together with Mondragon in Spain in 2008 to create a law to promote cooperative ecosystem, and Mondragon itself has a cooperative development fund, Sayolan, that has been in existence for some years. Chile as well has recently started one of these in 2021, and of course there are similar experiences such as in Canada, in Quebec with Desjardins, which some of you know, I'm sure. Spain, the Basque region, I'm sure all of you have heard and read the book by William and Catherine White, Making Mondragon, is also a fascinating and inspiring story with the local community escaping a similar double bind in a similarly challenging fascist environment. I don't want to tell the story of Mondragon. I recommend, if you don't know it, to read the book by the Whites. It's called Making Mondragon, I think 1990. But I wanted to just draw on one example, which is Lagunaro, which was actually, you could say, making a disadvantage and turning it into an advantage. So cooperative members at the time of the founding of Mondragon were not covered by the social security system. They were not considered employees. So basically, they had to start their own social security, and payroll deductions funded it. And over time, this is what Lagunaro is. It's their social security provisioning system. And today it is a successful insurance firm that provides anything from auto loans to life insurance. So again, you can turn a disadvantage into an advantage by working together. So Mondragon also is very interesting in that they have specific principles that go even beyond the ICA. They have 10 principles. We have a chapter in the upcoming book on those principles that specifically focus on the involvement of workers in management. That go in many ways beyond, as I say, the ICA. They call this, what do they call it? Emancipation, rather responsibility as emancipation. So a very emancipatory, basically ethos or philosophy that is behind these Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque region in Spain. We also, in the already released book, have a chapter on the tensions in the Mondragon cooperatives between the entrepreneurial and sustainability focus. So you can imagine, of course, as practitioners, that there's oftentimes difficult dilemmas and choices you have to make between maintaining a certain line of business and changing that in order to meet certain other principles like sustainability. So you're dealing with a lot of challenges, and as are they, and this is not unusual. So this is, again, another reason why the democratic model of cooperatives is important, because you're talking to members, you're talking to each other about what to do and what's the right thing to do, instead of having this hierarchical, pyramid-like, technocratic, so to speak, governance model. Costa Rica could be considered a cooperative commonwealth. They have no military. They've used the money since 1948. They disbanded the military for dealing with education, public health. All of the country's hospitals, for instance, and public universities are funded in that way. They do a lot of environmental protection, focusing on human rights, climate change, and animal rights. They also, people ask me, well, what do they do for defense? They do have a police force that they utilize sometimes for when there is a need. So like Chinese trawlers in their waters, for instance, and other things. So they have efforts for national cultural preservations and many other projects. They in fact even have a cooperative university. We have a chapter in the upcoming book by Federico Li Bonilla on a cooperative spin-off model. So I'm sure a lot of you know about the university spin-off model. What oftentimes happens is you have publicly funded research that is then privatized, and that's a very ethical, that's an ethical problem. So the idea could be to spin out a cooperative. Why not? So, okay, you know, in quiz shows, there's a lightning round. I just want to go very quickly because I know there's other things to do and say here. So just very roughly, quickly, we have some chapters on Africa dealing with Ubuntu, classical African ethic that deals with community and the fact that we all are embedded in community. On the left is chapter 5 from the first book. On the right is chapter 10 from the new book that deals with informal credit cooperatives in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, and how these are basically being injected with a kind of a new energy through digital technology. So this is going on. The banker ladies, so they draw a lot on the tradition of banker ladies in the African diaspora as well. Asia, we have women's cooperatives. There's a chapter on the role of women in social cooperatives and social care provision in India, in Turkey, and Poland. So on the left, there's a picture of the board of directors of one cooperative in India, all women. On the right, there's a cooperative that focuses on integrating Syrian refugees in Turkey, all women. And there's also a picture on the bottom. Karen, you might know this, the JAs in Japan, you'll hear more about this, which were originally agricultural cooperatives, but since have become one-stop shops for dealing with many things, providing credit, even some insurance. So basically they do anything that you can find, they do basically. You'll hear more about that from Karen. Latin America, we have the empresas recuperadas. These are recovered enterprises by their workers. Argentina is a country facing a continual crisis, so oftentimes there is no other alternative than starting a cooperative. My friend Marcelo has written a book about this, and we do have a chapter in the new book about these types of cooperatives and how the political economy of Argentina has promoted that. Also, this kind of model of struggle and conversion is basically moving away from Argentina and going to other places like in Italy, where you have the longest ongoing factory occupation in Florence. It was an auto parts supplier bought by private equity. The workers said, well, why are you closing us? We are still profitable, and we want to basically adapt, and they want to create cargo bikes and photovoltaic panels. So again, that's an ongoing struggle that there's a chapter on, one of the last chapters in our book, the one that's upcoming. We have even some things in Europe. There's the cooperative ESOP that I myself am developing with colleagues like Tegonza on the top right here. It's based in many ways on the employee stock ownership plan here in the US, and in the UK on the employee ownership trust. That's actually quite successful. And of course the ESOP, as you know, emerged in the 1950s with people like Louis Kelso, and it was started actually to maintain newspapers, local newspapers. The Peninsula Group in California that would have closed because the owners wanted to sell it, or actually basically they wanted to retire, so they sold it to the workers. So again, a cooperative even can be a tool to maintain local newspapers. The EOT, the Employee Ownership Trust, emerged in the UK in 2014 and has seen exponential growth. You see on the graph in the middle there, and about half of firm successions now in the UK are going towards employee ownership trusts. And so we want to take the best practices of the ESOPs and the EOTs and create what we're calling a European ESOP. Instead of a trust taking over the business, it's a cooperative. And so we're basically developing that model in Slovenia, where there's a law being passed right now to promote this cooperative ESOP. And we're now basically copying their activities in Slovenia, in Serbia, and in Germany right now, where we're starting an association. The Pegasus Enterprise is a picture of Francesca Martinelli, who wrote a wonderful chapter in the handbook on these types of networks of autonomous cultural workers. So cultural workers are very important. And so you have basically co-ops like Smart and Doc Servizi that are doing a lot of exciting things for people like set designers, dancers, theater people, actors, and so on, even people in the tech scene. There's the Desjardins Environmental Fund, which is the largest cooperative bank in Canada, the first cooperative bank in North America. They were the first to start basically a mutual fund that was indexed to non-financial criteria, including environmentalism. And it actually emerged from a member basically who suggested that people from the organization will develop an environmental consciousness if projects come from them, if they're the ones to choose and develop them according to whatever they find relevant. Again, this kind of member-based thing. So I think that co-ops are also a vaccine in many ways against fascism. I have an article coming out in Jacobin comparing Italy and Germany and their experiences in fascism. And basically the lesson is that in Italy, the pressure for change from below has led to the permanent adaptation of the legal basis, while Germany basically worked almost 50 years on a single cooperative reform, which was finally enacted in 2006. So being in touch with the various ecosystems, and again, the contact to legislation and policy is important to underline that. There's a Native American cooperative tradition. You have local Native American cooperative traditions like the Winnebago here dealing with community-based wealth, and of course the idea of questioning ownership as an idea in itself. So we have a chapter on relational ecological cooperation with a more than human world by Meredith Dejansky, and very fascinating and inspiring ways of dealing with nature and the natural world rather than seeing it as an object to own. Of course, you have the wampum here from the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois on the top right, the Hiawatha wampum, which in itself is a symbol of cooperation amongst various tribes that had buried the hatchet, as the saying goes. So dealing with I'm coming to the end now, lessons and prospects for growth in Minnesota. I think you can build on local traditions. You should emphasize the legislative framework that incentivizes the growth of the cooperative sector and deal with a kind of cooperative notion of entrepreneurship, and of course connecting to institutional actors and advocates. So Minnesota has its own traditions to build on. Co-ops were very important between 1870 and 1940 here. Stephen Keller wrote the book Cooperative Commonwealth. And of course, they had a very important role at the intersection of economics, ethnicity, and religion. You had the Midland cooperative wholesale. 40% of Minnesota farmers were in co-ops in 1914. You had farmer and owned and run co-ops like this Midland Cooperative that was run on a democratic one-member, one-vote basis, and challenged the primacy of corporations. In the 1930s, it stood out for its promotion of a citizenry that exercised economic as well as political leadership, and it had about 300,000 members in 700 cooperatives. And building on that tradition is certainly something that you can do, and of course you have a even rich literary tradition with the Midland Cooperative newspaper that can be drawn on, including local Native American traditions. So of course it's in some sense disappeared. So the rise in living standards, as Nick Stewart Block says, the attacks on cooperatives from the media, the effort to emulate big corporations contributed to a cooperative movement that had all the signs of business success but little interest in the broader ideological victories. And many farmer members by the 1970s looked at the cooperative as a marketing alternative rather than something bigger than that. But as Block argues, the history can nonetheless demonstrate how notions of democracy can be expanded beyond electoral politics. These traditions can be revived. So of course, the laws are needed that are based on acute needs, that should incentivize startups and scale-ups and also business conversions. And I think lessons like those from Italy can be learned from. And of course, I can only repeat what has been said. Member democracy is absolutely essential. This is a book that I find to be a resource. Cooperative entrepreneurship, new concepts of entrepreneurship beyond individualism. So things like this Pegasus company or distributed leadership models that we discuss, community-based entrepreneurship that we also mention in the book. My friend Nathan Schneider has the notion of exit to community, moving away from venture capital towards community-based wealth building. Institutional actors, I work with the Evolution Institute. We are a 501c a charity building a local wealth and community building. We would be interested in partnering, of course, with local actors here, developing the cooperative movement and connecting to broader stakeholder networks. I'm sure there are others. Federations, apex organizations are important, developing communities of practice, ecosystem thinking, building up accelerators, incubators, cooperative development funds, and building bridges to allies like employee-owned businesses, foundations, associations, churches, charities, political parties, unions. Absolutely important stuff. So I'm just rushing through the end here. Conclusions. Benjamin Franklin was asked at the Continental Congress by someone, what kind of government have you given us, Ben? He said, a republic if you can keep it. I see it very similarly with the cooperative. You have a co-op if you can keep it. So we have many crises now with tariffs and other things. Local businesses here, including co-ops, can escape the double bind if they work together. So doing cooperation in an evolutionary context context actually requires communication that considers pluralism, diversity, and heterogeneity of needs and resources. Co-ops are problem solvers. They are good at all these things. They need help. They need an enabling environment. And today, together, rather, we can build this type of environment that's built based on best practices. Thank you.
A question? Yeah, a couple. Yeah. So we're ready to walk around mics. We have Justin here in the back. You can wave either he or I down for a couple questions. I have one. If no one, raise your hand.
Just
if you
exhausted, I guess.
Hi, thank you for that amazing presentation. And as a room full of people who maybe live and breathe cooperatives, but really need to bring community members who maybe have never heard them into this fold, what is your favorite opening line for telling someone who has no experience with cooperatives what they mean?
Oh, that's a difficult one. Well, I mean, this notion of the dual nature, I was just at a cooperative conference in Helsinki, Finland, and we discussed this notion of the dual nature by Draheim. And one guy, I forget his name, he referred to it as an elevator pitch. So that could be one thing, this notion of the dual nature. Co-ops are not just businesses, they are also an association of members. Although we did kind of dispute, or not, there was a debate on this notion because many cooperatives also go beyond just serving their members. So in many ways, that could even be seen as a kind of dusty narrative. So, I mean, that's one thing. Co-ops are not just business, they're businesses, they're associations, and in fact of members, but also they can even go beyond that. So I see them as problem solvers, natural problem solvers, and they start from this associational thing. And it's like you have a family car, and the family car is shared, but you can use it for many things. You can go grocery shopping with it. You can take someone to church. You can, and there are many problems, so to speak, that co-ops can solve. And so I think that's something that I always hammer on when I talk to people about it. And you're right, actually, there are so many people who don't know what co-ops are. I was even giving a guest lecture at a course at Harvard Business School. And I mean, you would imagine that these are the brightest and the smartest. And the professor actually turned to me when I was finished. He said, I didn't know about any of these things. So, I mean, it's a matter of just getting that out there and telling people, okay, there are such things as member-oriented businesses.
Hello. Hi.
Oh, hi.
Victoria McWayne Creek with Onyx Collective out of West Central Minnesota. You were touching on the community entrepreneurship. Can you give a little bit more information about how that can revitalize and where you might recommend we start that conversation, particularly as Black folks in rural communities?
Well, this chapter that I mentioned could be very useful, and it's in the upcoming book. Let's see, it's here, this one, the Community Cooperatives and Institutional Innovation. So in that chapter, we look at the theory of institutional innovation. So how do new institutions emerge? I mean, even things like the B Corporation is a new institution, a new way of doing business, in many ways principles-based, and or the Community Land Trust. At one point it didn't exist. You had certain examples in Georgia, in rural Georgia during the Civil Rights Movement. And then Bernie Sanders, when he was mayor of Burlington, started a community land trust. And today the Burlington Community Land Trust is the largest one in existence. And it's spread all over the world. We even have them in Europe. So the idea of community cooperatives and this basically local wealth generation and self-management of resources oftentimes emerges on the basis of an acute need. So you get sometimes students, university students who are from rural villages, and they maybe have a course on community development, and they learn something like this, and they come back to their local village because they see the value of that village and they don't want to move away. So I was in the south of Italy visiting some of these, and this is how I saw this model emerging in time again. It was local actors who felt a perceived need, an acute need, and they banded together to resolve that problem. And oftentimes through word of mouth, others heard about it and they said, well, we can do that here. In one case, it was a school cafeteria that was closing because the school board was infiltrated by the mafia. Maybe not the problem here, but in any case, the idea was that, oh, they went online. What can we do? How can we serve our children meals in school? And they found a similar example in a neighboring village that had created this community cooperative. And they said, let's do that. And so that's how they basically solved that problem. And so I think oftentimes it's a matter of word of mouth, learning about what's going on, even very close by. And then, of course, finding sympathetic, let's say, municipal governments that are willing to assist or even tolerate. So in some cases, I found governments that really weren't, so let's say they weren't willing partners, but they found, okay, these people are doing this. It takes it off of my hands, no skin off my nose, that kind of attitude. And as long as you get a tolerant government, then you already have that resource there that you're not fighting. Like in Jackson, Mississippi, I don't know if you know Cooperation Jackson, they're constantly fighting with the government of Mississippi, who is trying to kind of undermine them. So local regeneration of rural communities can only be possible if people are empowered to self-organize. So you need to find allies and get the ball rolling. That's my experience as a researcher.
Got time for 2 more questions if folks have them.
Hi, thank you. I'm Jack. I'm here with Jill as part of the Paper Moon Childcare Cooperative. Oh, I'm here.
Okay.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the worker-owned model as opposed to like a consumer co-op or a resource co-op.
Sure. I mean, that's a topic very close to my heart, and I don't, just to say forthrightly, I don't think that these models are necessarily opposed. So in Mondragon, I mentioned, for instance, you have Eroski. Eroski is a supermarket chain that is both a consumer and a worker cooperative, and probably emerged because of this very strong worker cooperative focus that I mentioned that Mondragon has. So they purchased, or they developed this consumer cooperative and said, well, we are workers, so why don't we introduce that there? So the idea there is they have about 50,000 consumer members and 8,000 worker members, and any decision that is made has to be basically on the consensus of both of those pools of members. So that is, to me, an interesting example how you can combine both worker ownership and, let's say, a consumer cooperative. And so, of course, the distinction there in the worker cooperative model is this idea of the basically labor management. You have laborers who are on the board, who also select perhaps their executive, their CEO or general manager, and that's to be distinct from, say, if you're a member of a bank and you then as a consumer member or as a let's say supplier of capital to the bank are then selecting the CEO. I think this notion of worker cooperative or cooperation of workers is a very essential part of the DNA of the cooperative movement, and should not be, so to speak, neglected. And you have many, let's say, consumer cooperatives. We have a chapter in the handbook that looks at worker cooperatives and other cooperatives. And I mean, it's a diversity of perspectives that we have in the book, but it's a very radical thesis. They basically suggest many consumer cooperatives in the end are not very much different than a standard corporation, because there are disputes between laborers. And I think that providing rights and voice to workers in a cooperative, whatever the type, is one way to ensure that you're walking the talk, so to speak. But I'm sure there are differences of opinion there. And so I think I'll just say there's an importance in connecting the tradition of the workers' movement, which of course also extends to unions, but there has been historically a worker cooperative, let's say, branch of that movement to the greater cooperative universe. I think there's an importance in recognizing the connection there and the ties there and the mutual, let's say, struggles, and not forgetting that. Thank you for the question.
Final question right here.
Hi, how are you? I'm Mariana, and we're from the Minnesota Drivers Co-op.
Yes, we spoke.
This is our first time doing this, and we just want to know what advice would you give us as we're just starting out. And this is a risky business, and we know we're fighting against Uber and Lyft, and these are the biggest competitors that we have right now. We want to know what advice could you give us because we're there to win, we're there to succeed, and there's nothing going to stop us. We come from far, and we work with two wonderful individuals, Christina and Electra from Nexus and MCCD, and this is Marguerite and later right here. But we want to know, what can we do? What advice can you give us? We listen to your speeches. I take notes. I'm going to look some of these references that you give us. What can you tell us? The advice can you give us? Because we need all the help we can get. We're not going to turn anything away. And this is a risky business because drivers, when you go out there on the road to drive, we're putting our lives at risk every day that we go on the road. There's no guarantee we'll make it back home. So basically, these things and these concerns that we have, we're still moving forward to do what we need to do. What advice can you give us? I know you're going to give some details when we spoke yesterday, and this is some things that is concerned, and with your help, probably we could move mountains instead of just one brick at a time.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
So I did some research on a similar drivers cooperative in Montreal when I was doing my doctoral dissertation. And I recall the discussion with one of their drivers. I think his name was Martin. And Martin told me he loved Uber and compared with driving a taxi, which he felt was less dangerous. And in the similar way, he preferred Uber over the taxi driving, classical taxi driving. He preferred Eva over Uber. So I think one of the issues is convincing drivers and showing them, just demonstrating them by practice, that the worker-owned model of the rideshare app is to their advantage. And in fact, again, it's not just about giving them a voice, but giving them certain benefits as well. And part of it, of course, is just getting out that word of mouth. And of course, understanding the risks that are involved and the overall harsh, I would say, or unconducive environment. So you had these propositions in California that moved to consider workers in rideshare apps employees. And of course, Uber and Lyft spent, $50 million to convince people, oh, this would remove people's freedom. So finding local municipalities, finding, for instance, mayors who are interested in working together with local businesses rather than having, a vulture, so to speak, capitalists coming in, which this is what Uber is. It was not profitable for decades. I think they only turned a profit about 5 years ago. So for a long time, it was a matter of price dumping, and really understanding that and understanding the environment. We have a chapter in the handbook on platform cooperatives, looking at them as a form of commons, and basically extending that notion of commons to technology. We have 2 chapters actually in the upcoming book. One is on the problems of platform cooperatives specifically, and connecting those to the problems of cooperatives historically. So a lot of the same problems are emerging in this platform model that cooperators have been dealing with since the 19th century or even before. Of course, some of them are different, and they're different in their magnitude and in their area, of course, of focus, but there are very shared experiences of struggle against a hostile environment. I had mentioned often in talks that the Rochdale pioneers in Rochdale near Manchester, actually on their opening night day, they were lighting their business with candles because the local gas company cut off the gas. They didn't want the cooperative to emerge. So there is a shared history of struggle in the history of cooperatives that, of course, now is emerging in this platform environment. Now you have the new frontier of AI, of course, which will also be something that will affect rideshare apps and others and other businesses. We will have a chapter in the upcoming book on cooperative ways of organizing AI. So I think it's just a matter of doing it. And of course, getting partners, getting allies, especially where you can in local government. If you can get local government, perhaps they can give you an advantage in giving certain access to certain public institutions, like hospitals, for instance. I know in the Madison Cab Cooperative, there's a Madison Union Cab cooperative in Madison, Wisconsin. They have partners in public institutions like hospitals. They do patients, that drive to and from the hospital. They get called to bring the patients there. So you have a customer pool there. So there's the Cleveland model of cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio. They have a similar model where there's worker cooperatives that work together with certain public anchor institutions. And so I think it's the matter of getting those partnerships and scaling those up from wherever you are at the grassroots local level, then to the regional level. And then maybe one day you will you'll have Uber, out of the way.